pressure cooker for weeks, and now the heat is spilling into its narrowest arteries. Naval movements, boardings, and diplomatic warnings have transformed routine tankers into potential flashpoints. Behind the scenes, capitals from Moscow to Beijing to Islamabad are moving to steady what they describe as fraying lines of negotiation, even as Tehran and Washington trade public accusations that edge ever closer to open hostility. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, speaking in a call with Iran's top diplomat, framed the latest maritime episode as another instance where US action at sea risks undoing fragile diplomacy. He warned that what Moscow calls an unlawful US naval blockade and the recent seizure of an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel are not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that could drag the region into wider conflict. The tone was urgent. Russia wants all channels kept open, it said, and it cautioned that a return to open confrontation would imperil shipping, energy markets, and any chance at stabilizing talks that have only just begun. Iran, which has been resolute in its rhetoric and selective in its enforcement, answered publicly and without ambiguity. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said, if this situation, which they have termed a naval blockade, continues, the Islamic Republic of Iran will certainly undertake all necessary reciprocal measures. You should have no doubt about this. The Islamic Republic of Iran is both the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz and wherever it becomes necessary in the implementation of measures that guarantee the interests and rights of the Iranian nation of measures that guarantee the interests and rights. It will not show any leniency or compromise whatsoever. That declaration was not a flourish. It was a line drawn in the water. It was a line drawn in the water. Tehran has repeatedly signaled it sees control of the Strait of Hormuz as both a strategic leverage point and a national security red line. Beijing, too, has stepped into the diplomatic cross-current. At a briefing in Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun delivered an unusually pointed appeal to all parties to restrain their naval activity and honor the ceasefire that is, at least nominally, still holding. Guo Jiakun said, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is both sensitive and complex. We express our serious concern regarding the United States' forced interception of relevant vessels. We hope that all parties involved will adopt a responsible attitude and strictly adhere to the ceasefire agreement to avoid escalating contradictions and further intensifying the situation and to provide the necessary conditions for the Strait's passage to return to normal. The conflict framed its message as pragmatic. The Strait must remain open not simply for regional partners, but for global commerce. The numbers underline the point. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and substantial volumes of liquefied natural gas transit these waters, meaning any disruption travels quickly from Tanker D to markets around the world. Chinese President Xi Jinping has echoed that concern at the highest level, stressing in calls with regional leaders that uninterrupted navigation is a shared global interest. He told the Saudi Crown Prince that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open to normal navigation, a plea couched in the language of mutual economic dependence and geopolitical stability. Beijing is not hiding its stake. As the world's largest buyer of Iranian crude, China's economy is directly implicated when tanker traffic is disrupted or when prices spike. That worry about markets goes hand in hand with a broader diplomatic calculus. Islamabad, which took on a mediating role in recent weeks, finds itself squeezed. Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Azim Munir, a central figure in shuffle diplomacy, reportedly warned US decision makers that ongoing naval pressure and the seizure of vessels undermined Pakistan's ability to convene follow-up talks. Islamabad has tried to use back channels to press both sides toward resumed negotiations, arguing that face-to-face diplomacy, away from the glare of public theatrics, offered the best chance to widen an already narrow window for peace. Washington, for its part, insists its maritime steps are lawful and necessary to prevent the movement of weapons and to uphold sanctions where they exist. A senior delegation led publicly by US Vice President J.D. Vance had been slated to travel to the region to press for a de-escalation of both kinetic strikes and the economic pressures that have ratcheted up tensions. That mission was tied to a ceasefire timetable and to the fragile trust being threaded through the talks. As naval actions continue, Tehran said it would not rejoin talks, while what it called pressure at sea persisted. That position has hardened public postures and complicated the managers of mediation, including Pakistan. The maritime incidents are not abstract. A U.S. boarding of an Iranian cargo vessel set off in the Gulf of Oman set off a diplomatic chain reaction. Tehran called the boarding an act of piracy and vowed to respond. Allies in Moscow and Beijing quickly registered their unease. Russian officials portrayed the US move as inconsistent with the diplomatic path to peace and warned that any slide back into confrontation could endanger the entire Gulf and complicate international efforts to stabilize shipping and energy flows. Markets have reacted to the prospect of prolonged disruption. Freight has rerouted, insurance costs for transits through the strait have surged, and a backlog of tankers waiting for clearance has reduced effective capacity. Nations that rely heavily on Gulf supplies have made discreet inquiries into contingency routes and emergency fuel purchases. The ripple effects are immediate. Higher fuel prices, tighter shipping schedules, and a global reminder of how intertwined energy security and geopolitics remain. Iran's approach has been mere, short where it serves Tehran's aims and forceful where it does not. While Iranian authorities have largely exempted Russian commercial vessels from transit restrictions, they have alternately warned foreign shipping to avoid risky proximity to military movements. Tehran's public messaging emphasizes sovereignty and readiness to protect national interests, and it deploys those statements to signal both resolve and restraint. A delicate balancing act, meant to convey that Tehran can both hurt global energy flows and exercise control over escalation. Russia, meanwhile, has presented itself as a steadying voice. Moscow has called repeatedly for restraint, arguing that renewed fighting at sea would imperil civilian maritime traffic and choke off supplies that power economies far beyond the Gulf. Russian officials say keeping diplomatic channels open is the immediate priority, briefing partners that the alternative is unpredictable and dangerous. The diplomatic landscape is crowded and contradictory. China has floated a four-point proposal intended to stabilize the region, a mix of ceasefire preservation, facilitation of humanitarian aid, restraint on arms transfers, and a call for renewed diplomatic dialogue. Guo Jiakun summarized Beijing's posture this way. China supports relevant parties to maintain the ceasefire and negotiation momentum, and guided by President Xi Jinping's four-point proposal, will continue to promote de-escalation, playing a constructive role in ultimately achieving lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. That language signals Beijing's desire to project itself as a multilateral broker, even as it warns against any actions that might sever the fragile thread of talks. At the same time, political pressure in Washington and beyond complicates the picture. Public threats and political ultimatums, including warnings about tariffs or sanctions tied to military support, frame state behavior in stark transactional terms. Meanwhile, regional CB Bipoles watch the theatre closely, aware that any misstep could trigger a chain of reciprocal actions with little room for reversal. The human cost, even now, is already mounting. Insurance crews, merchant mariners, and port workers operate under added strain. Fishermen and coastal communities around the Gulf face economic disruption, while their daily safety becomes an afterthought to big power posturing. Diplomatic staff move under instructions to reduce exposure, and embassies tighten security as they juggle evacuation plans with urgent shuttle diplomacy. Even where officials speak in measured tones, their words carry force. In Islamabad's mediation efforts, for example, Pakistan's leadership made the case that pressure at sea undermines the very negotiations they are trying to host for the conflict. Whether that calculus will be persuasive enough to deter further boardings or interdictions depends on decisions being taken in short order by Washington and Tehran, and by the commanders at sea, who are, in some cases, operating under orders that leave little margin for negotiation in the moment. There are no simple solutions. Avoiding a wider war will require a mix of political courage and tactical patience, clear assurances on maritime freedom, confidence-building measures to prevent misidentification at sea, and reliable channels that let envoys trade firm commitments without the spectacle of military coercion in the background. Regional powers and global stakeholders will have to accept uncomfortable compromises, temporary exemptions, neutral verification mechanisms, or carefully choreographed pauses in certain operations, if they hope to stabilize a corridor that countless economies depend on. For all the talk of leverage, the Strait of Hormuz is not a bargaining chip without consequences. Closing or disrupting it would hurt the very actors who might consider doing so. That reality is partly why China, Russia, and other states are urging restraint, even as they criticize US tactics. Keeping the strait open matters to all of them. Yet the calculus of deterrence is inherently unstable. One side's demonstration of resolve invites another's countermeasure, and the margin between a naval interdiction and a naval clash is perilously narrow. Diplomacy now must work on two tracks: immediate firefighting to stop incidents from spiraling, and a parallel, patient effort to restore trust. The first requires clear, communicated rules of engagement at sea and hotlines that work in real time. The second demands political compromises that are always harder to sell at home than they are to sign in the presence of foreign ministers and generals. Pakistan's mediation attempt illustrates the second track: a neutral venue, enough face-to-face time to test intents, and a credible timetable. But the urgency of the moment threatens to shrink the space for compromise. The Coven rejects the framing that places the blame solely on its shoulders. In private, some Iranian officials acknowledge that any move to constrict global flows would have blowback, not least for their own revenues. Yet Tehran's insistence on defending what it calls its sovereign rights in the strait remains firm. That posture complicates any simple diplomatic fix. When one side emphasizes control of a choke point as essential to its security, the other side's insistence on freedom of navigation becomes a confrontation over sovereign claims. For the moment, the overriding message from secondary powers is straightforward: keep the strait open. From Beijing's top leader to Moscow's foreign ministry and Pakistan's army chief, the consistent refrain is that the window for peace must be protected from incidents at sea and from public brinkmanship. Whether those appeals will be sufficient to keep tankers moving and diplomats talking depends on decisions that must be taken now, and on the capacity of all sides to put short-term tactical gains behind the longer, harder task of stabilizing a region that the world cannot afford to lose. If diplomacy succeeds, the result will look prosaic: a routine of verified commitments, resumed talks, and a cautious normalization of shipping. If it fails, the costs will be immediate and widespread: higher energy prices, disrupted supply chains, and a geopolitical shock that reaches far beyond the Gulf. The choice is not theoretical. It is being made day by day on the bridges of warships and in the sealed rooms where ministers speak quietly. As negotiators keep the lines open and as commanders at sea weigh the next moves, the world watches a narrow channel carrying enormous stakes. The coming days will test whether restraint can outpace the impulse to punish and whether the choreography of diplomacy can outmaneuver the raw logic of coercion at sea. The answer will determine not just the fate of a fragile truce, but the steadiness of a global energy system that depends on peaceful passage through one of the world's most consequential fresh waterways.